Hi everyone, this is week 11 of science fiction and I'm Professor Ellis with this week's lecture. I hope everybody's still doing well, that you're taking care of yourselves, masking up, getting vaccines when they're available. I got my appointment set up for this week for my first shot, so I'm looking forward to getting that and starting that sequence. And whenever you get that opportunity, I want to encourage you to do the same thing. Because it's something that we can work together to dig ourselves out of this pandemic hole. We need to try to do that as quickly as we can. But of course, while that's like one of the big concerns, our ultimate concern right now is our science fiction class and your other classes at City Tech. So I just want to also remind you all that anything that can impact how well you're doing in our class, make sure that you reach out to me. You know my email address, jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. Remember, I have my office hours via Google Hangouts on Wednesdays from 3 to 5 p.m. And I can also meet with you by appointment. Just send me an email. Let me know what your availability is like for the next few days at least, so I can try and find a time in my schedule that will sync with your availability. I know that you're all very busy, so I think that we can try to work around our different but yet equally hectic schedules to make things work. Okay, so let's get into it. So for week 11, I want to also extend an extra word about the extra credit assignment. We'll get into the lecture, and with the lecture, I'll say that I'm mixing things up because the way that I had structured the readings and viewings in this part of the semester was to make it so you wouldn't have too much to do at one point in time, but that puts some of our readings out of sequence with the actual lectures. So as long as you're keeping up with the reading and you're listening to the lectures, you'll be doing totally fine. I only say this because you'll find that I'm not going to talk about James Tiptree Jr. today. I'm going to save that for next week when I begin talking about Feminist SF. But as you know from the syllabus, the Star Trek viewing is not due until this coming week, but I'm going to talk about Star Trek today. So the lecture is a little out of sequence with what you're doing with the readings and viewings, but once you get through all the lectures, all the readings, obviously you will have all the information that you need to learn for our class. Then we'll talk a little bit about the research essay, and then we'll discuss homework at the very end. So first off, with the extra credit, I realized not everybody was able to go to the Literary Arts Festival, which I think was a great success. We had really great attendance for the Zoom webinar. A lot of people watched it on YouTube Live. We had the Chancellor of CUNY there, and that's a really big deal. I mean, he's never, of all the past CUNY chancellors, and if you're not aware, the chancellor is the person who is kind of in charge of the entire city university system. So in the past 40 years, no chancellor had ever been to the Literary Arts Festival and opened it. And this was the first time that we were able to have the chancellor participate in the Literary Arts Festival. So it's really showing how the things that we're doing at City Tech, the things that students just like you are doing at City Tech, matter and are being recognized by the larger CUNY community. So if that's, that in itself should be enough reason, I think, to go to the Literary Arts Festival if you have the time. But for those of you that couldn't, because your work schedules or other classes, you can also view the Literary Arts Festival now on YouTube just as a video. It's about 2 hours long for the whole program. But if you weren't able to go, but you still wanted to get that extra credit, you can watch the video on YouTube. I've embedded it right here on our Open Lab course site. And then just write me an email that's about 250 words long, excuse me, about your experience. So I give some prompts here, like, who did you hear speak? whose work resonated with you, because you're going to hear like students talk about their photography, their writing, videos that they made, and some of those students' works and their experiences may connect with like your own experience or how you feel about how things have been this past year. Well, tell me about that. Which of those are things that like you think were important or that you had deeper meaning for you? And essentially, what did you take away from the event? But 250 words is one page double spaced. Make sure you include the names of speakers if you're referencing them, and then just email that to me, and I'll give you that extra credit. And again, that can take the place of a missed weekly writing assignment, or I can use that to apply some points to one of the bigger assignments in the class. And I'll put that extra credit wherever it will help you the most. So you don't have to tell me where it goes. When I look at your grades, I'll be able to say, oh, this will fit better here, and boost your grade more than if I were to put it somewhere else. So you take advantage of this. And I also want to encourage you that when these kinds of events happen, whether they be virtual, during the pandemic, or once the pandemic is under control and we're back in person, go take advantage of these things. Go to these events. Go to the big ones like this, and go to the small ones as well. You'll find that whatever program you're in at City Tech will likely have different kinds of periodic events. They could be talks, they could be lectures, workshops, but those are extra learning experiences that you get for free because you're a student at City Tech. And I can't stress how influential sometimes these kinds of events can be. I can speak from my own experience as a student at Georgia Tech many years ago, that I went to events where I got to meet Stephen Wolfram, the inventor of Mathematica software. That was something that has left an indelible impression on my mind. And it certainly inspired me to continue working hard, not just in the humanities, but also my interest in science and technology. So whenever these types of events take place, definitely take advantage of them. And I'm just reminded now too, in 1996 thereabouts, NASA had a speaker come to Georgia Tech and gave a small talk. We were in a small room in the aeronautical engineering building, and they gave everybody there a CD-ROM with QuickTime movies and software about what was cutting-edge planetary exploration at that point, which was the Mars mission with the Sojourner autonomous robot vehicle. Very small guy, not very large in terms of what Perseverance, the current Mars lander that's exploring the planet Mars now. But if you imagine 1996, I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago. But certainly that's something at the time that filled me with inspiration for what we as human beings were capable of achieving. And certainly I can imagine that similar things are happening now with the work that's going on at NASA, and now with private companies that are getting involved in space exploration, such as SpaceX or Blue Origin. So I mean, there's a lot of really exciting things happening. It's just you need to keep your ear to the ground to find out when there might be chances where you get to interact with these people. And those things could be inspirational, but they may also open doors for you. But if you don't go to these events, you're not going to have that opportunity to shake someone's hand, to introduce yourself, to talk with them face to face or virtually right now over Zoom when these types of events are virtual. But take advantage of these things because they can, in a sense, matter a great deal. A small event could have a tremendous impact on your life later on. And I think that what we'll talk about with the Star Trek episode today is kind of exemplary of that. So extra credits there. It's available for everybody that wants to take advantage of it, and I encourage you to do so. Now, let's get into the lecture. So first off, I just wanted to mention some other writers that you might want to put into your notes that you could look up later. You don't have to memorize all these names, but these were some other very important New Wave SF writers that we didn't read for this part of our class. Some of I've mentioned before, like Brian Aldiss, who's was a British science fiction writer and science fiction critic / theorist. His book Billion Year Spree, which then was revised into the subsequent Trillion Year Spree, is a history of science fiction, and it's his work that points to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which we've talked about from the beginning of our class, is the origin of science fiction. So those ideas come from his work as a critic of science fiction, but he's also a writer of science fiction. There's Thomas M. Disch, Robert Silverberg, Pamela Zolene, Norman Spinrad, and I've also mentioned before Roger Zelazny, who co-wrote a book with Philip K. Dick. I mentioned his name in our last lecture. So these are some other names that you should be familiar with, and maybe you'll recognize if you see their books in the bookstore or on the library shelves. But the first writer that I want to dive into more detail during today's lecture, that you read his story I and Gomorrah for today's class, is Samuel R. Delany. And make sure that you have his full name in your notes with his middle initial, Samuel R. Delany, D-E-L-A-N-Y. And he was born in 1942. And you can see he is alive and healthy. This is a picture of Samuel R. Delany at City Tech a few years ago in the City Tech science fiction collection. So you see all those books and magazines on either side of him are part of the collection that we have at City Tech. And he came to give his keynote address to the second City Tech Science Fiction Symposium that I help run every year. So it was, we were very honored to have such an important science fiction writer at City Tech. Again, some exciting things are happening at City Tech right now in terms of all the different aspects of work that we're doing, both in terms of the humanities as well as science and technology. So Samuel R. Delany, his nickname is Chip. He's a writer and a critic. Okay, so he kind of like Brian Aldiss, I'd mentioned before. He's someone who writes science fiction, but is also a critic of science fiction, meaning that he's not necessarily criticizing it in the way that we may think of, like you're criticizing me, like you're putting me down. Is that he's questioning it, he's evaluating it, he's pointing out its strengths, its weaknesses, exploring what it means. This is what we mean when we say someone is a critic. It's not necessarily a negative thing in total. Now, Samuel R. Delany is an African American writer of science fiction, and he's one of the few gay writers of science fiction. He self-identifies as gay, but some call him bisexual because he was married to the Jewish American poet Marilyn Hacker from 1961 to 1980, who herself identifies as lesbian. And Delany and Hacker have one daughter. While Samuel R. Delany does not have a degree, he has been teaching writing and literature classes at major universities since 1988. He recently retired from teaching at Temple University in Philadelphia. Some of his critical works include The Jewel-Hinged Jaw, Notes on the Language of Science Fiction from 1977, The American Shore, Meditations on a Tale of Science Fiction from 1978, and Starboard Wine, W-I-N-E, More Notes on the Language of Science Fiction, 1984. These are as insightful as they are rigorously argued. The thing about Delany is that he has a very critical eye. He has a very good way of exploring issues, of interrogating the meaning behind things. So I mean, he is, as I would say, as good a critical writer as he is a science fiction writer. That he is an all-around excellent writer of science fiction and science fiction criticism. Now, while Samuel R. Delany has written short fiction, like what we read for today's class, what's unusual is the fact that his first published science fiction was a novel titled The Jewels of Aptor, A-P-T-O-R, in 1962. Usually at that time, writers would publish short fiction first to kind of get their foot in the door before moving on to getting a novel published. But he just started out publishing novels and then got some of his short science fiction published. Now, there's some characteristics of his stories that I would like you to have in your notes. And these are very emblematic, I think, of New Wave SF. That has more to do with the human side of things rather than like the science and technology side of things. But that doesn't mean that science and technology doesn't play a role in his work. They certainly do. But where is the focus at? And it has more to do with human beings and the interaction of human beings. So the first characteristic has to do with language, that it has to do with communication, linguistics. Linguistics is the study of language, and then of course language itself. And notably, Samuel R. Delany believes that our perception of reality depends on the language that we use. And this is something that a number of linguistic theorists argue, is that whatever is our primary language is that it shapes the way we think about the world. Because if you take a moment to consider, if you don't know the word for something, it's much harder to grasp it, to be able to talk about it. And so when you do have words available, those words are equally confining because they constrain the way that we might think or talk about a given subject. And so if you think, one of the emblematic examples has to do with Inuit Eskimos in the far north and in Alaska. They have dozens of words to describe snow, because for them snow is a very important part of life. That it's important to be able to recognize different types of snow in terms of its pack, its wetness, its hardness, etc., because that determines maybe what you can do in terms of your daily work life each day. Whereas someone like me, who grew up in southeast Georgia and very rarely saw snow growing up, in my mind there's just this idea of snow, just the single word snow. And while I can imagine different ways that it might look, feel, etc., I don't have words the same way that the Inuit people have for describing what type of snow they're dealing with. So language both confines and constricts in different ways the way that we're able to think about the world. Now, related to this is the study of semiotics, and this is a word that you ought to know. Just simply being someone in college, if you haven't encountered it before, make sure you put it in your notes. It's spelled S-E-M-I-O-T-I-C-S, semiotics. Semiotics is the study of linguistic signs. Semiotics is the study of linguistic signs. And when I say sign, I'm not talking about a street sign that out on the street, something that says stop or yield or pedestrian crossing. A linguistic sign is the relationship between what we think of in our mind, the sound that we associate with like what that word is for the thing, and then the thing itself in the real world. So you think of it as kind of like, tripartite. So if I think of like cat, in my mind, I have a vision of like what a cat looks like. I have the sound that I produce when I say the word cat. That sound, even though we think of it as a word, is really just a sound, cat. And then these things, that image in my mind, the sound that I produce in relation to that, is related to something in the real world, an actual physical cat, like Mose that I showed you in the beginning lecture, right? My tuxedo cat. The same could be true of anything, everything from like a mug, right? So I got my coffee mug. Well, in my mind, I have maybe a vision of what a mug looks like, just a general mug. Then there's the sound I make, mug. And then here's a specific mug in the real world that image and that sound relate to. And all of these together constitute the semiotic linguistic sign. And so this is a big part of Samuel R. Delany's work because he's an expert on language. And so he incorporates his knowledge of language in his stories in some really interesting and important ways. I'll talk about that in a minute. So the second characteristic is that he explores cultural difference and the social construction of identity. So he's looking at both differences between cultures, which are, in many ways arbitrary. I mean, there's no reason like, American culture has to be this particular way, but historical events and a lot of different forces, both on the individual scale and societal scale, influence how our culture is different than, say, like the UK or Germany or Japan or China or Russia. But also related to this is the social construction of identity. It's like, how is our identity constructed by all these different societal forces, social norms, ideas of popular culture, etc. All these things play a role in like how we think of ourselves and how others think of us, which I think is very important, particularly considering the events that are taking place right now in the world, particularly in the United States. A third characteristic is social background, is that Samuel R. Delany highlights the social background of his stories in colorful detail. Like, he really goes into the social background of the characters, of the setting, in a way that, like, if you were to read, like, say, an Isaac Asimov robot novel from mid-century, Asimov isn't going into that kind of background of the social setting in the same way that Delany does. A fourth characteristic is sexuality and eroticism. Because he's interested in people and our relationships to other people, obviously sexuality and eroticism play some role in that. And so he's making his stories much more realized in terms of the way real people think, act, and feel in the world. That, again, to use the example of Asimov, who is notoriously not incorporating sexuality or the sex lives of characters in his novels, Delany is depicting these characters in a much more real way by including things like sexuality and eroticism. A fifth characteristic is the main characters usually have physical or psychological damage. They're hurt in some way. And maybe through the story, this damage plays a role in both how they react to what they experience in the story, but can also play a role in the way that they're trying to find some kind of resolution or a way of simply living with these physical or psychological damages. Then a sixth characteristic is mythology is important. It could be an existing mythology, like say like Greek or Roman mythology, or it could be a mythology that's emergent within the story, like a mythology that he created for the story itself. And then finally, the plot of his stories is usually structured as a quest or a fantastic voyage, like the characters are trying to get someplace or accomplish some important goal. Now, it can be argued that Samuel R. Delany has had different audiences in his career. A wide traditional readership up to and including the novel Dahlgren, which I'll talk about in a second, and that's spelled Dhalgren. And then a narrower, perhaps more intellectual, campus-based, meaning like college-based readership thereafter. So you can kind of see in his novels like these, you have to imagine who is his real audience for these things, and it probably has changed over time. But now going back earlier in his career, one of the novels I wanted to tell you about is called Babel 17, Babel-17. Babel 17 was published in 1966, and it won a Nebula Award and reveals a notable advance in sophistication in Samuel R. Delany's writing. Babel 17, whose chapters carry epigraphs from the work of Samuel R. Delany's wife, the poet Marilyn Hacker, is about language and has a poet heroine, meaning like the hero of the story is this female poet. In a future galactic society, radio broadcasts in an apparent alien language are received. They are thought to be connected with sabotage and possible alien invasion. And then much of the novel has to do with this poet heroine cracking the language, deciphering the language. So that's Babel 17. Another novel I wanted to mention is The Einstein Intersection. And Einstein is spelled Einstein, intersection, Intersection. The Einstein Intersection from 1967. This is a very densely written novel full of really colorful imagery. And the story features an Earth that has lost its humans. Like there aren't any humans on Earth, and how is never really made clear. But their corporeal form has been taken on by a race of aliens who, in an attempt to make coherent sense of the alien artifacts among which they live, take on human traditions too. So if you imagine all the human beings on Earth are gone, but all of our technology, our buildings, our books, all this stuff still is here. And these aliens come along kind of like archaeologists and anthropologists and discover what's left of our civilization. And they want to try to make sense of it. And so they have the ability to make themselves look like us and then in a sense act out human existence in order to try to understand what it was like to be human. So in the story there are avatars of Ringo Starr from the Beatles, Billy the Kid, the gunslinger, and even Christ. The hero is a black musician who plays tunes on his murderous machete. The book is a tour de force, though a cryptic one, since the bafflement of the protagonist trying to make sense of their transformed lives tends to transfer to the reader. Samuel R. Delany's own diaries provide part of the text of the novel. So it's a very interesting, in a sense, mashup between not just the novel as a story, but then how it intersects. You're thinking of the title with Samuel R. Delany's own personal experiences and his thinking with his diary entries. And then before we get to today's story, I wanted to tell you about my favorite novel by Samuel R. Delany, and that's Dahlgren, Dhalgren, Dahlgren. And this is from 1975. Dahlgren is a very postmodern novel, meaning that it's very experimental. It uses high literature to engage the reader in some challenging ways that the reader has to work, in a sense, to decipher. It has some controversial elements, but it was a bestseller. And I will say it's also very long. So what the novel is about is an anonymous youth, simply nicknamed the Kid, comes to the violent, nihilistic city of Bologna, where order has fled and there are 2 moons in the sky, though the rest of this near future United States of America is apparently normal. So it's like you don't really know where exactly this is. It seems like it's America, but we only have 1 moon. And so in this story, there are now 2 moons, this unknown city called Bologna, but everything else seems kind of like it's the United States. The Kid becomes an artist. He makes relationships, he gets in fights, and he writes a book that might be the book that we're reading called Dahlgren before he leaves the city. So that you can see that there's a self-reflexivity, meaning that the novel is essentially referring to itself. And it also has this mirror structure where the Kid enters the story, creates the novel Dahlgren, and then leaves the city. The opening sentence completes the unfinished final sentence, and essentially makes an enigmatic circle. It is a book primarily about the possibilities and difficulties of youth culture, and partly about being a writer. And so more about what I mean about it being a postmodern work of fiction. So before we can talk about postmodernism, modernity, modernity, is roughly the period beginning with the Enlightenment through the Industrial Revolution to the Second World War. So this is kind of like the early part of science fiction. Remember, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, comes out of the Enlightenment. So it is also a part of this period we call modernity. Now, modernity is focused on grand narratives or big ideas that were considered universal, meaning that they apply to everybody no matter where you live or what your background is. One of these grand narratives is the liberal humanist idea of identity, or a centered self, meaning that what you consider yourself is immutable. It's one thing that doesn't change over time. It's not influenced by the outside world. Now, on the other hand, postmodernism follows and overlaps the end of modernity, and it is characterized by an array of cultural theories and attitudes that have developed as skepticism, meaning some doubt, colored with irony, emphasizing language and power relations toward long-standing Western universalized theories and beliefs, including the idea of human progress, the power of reason and rationality, objective reality, and even the human. Modernism had already brought into question many of these issues, especially concerning the human as center of the self and of the world. But postmodernism extends and critiques these earlier reformulations. So if we think about New Wave SF, Samuel R. Delany, Harlan Ellison, and others, we can call them all postmodern writers as well. It is during the postmodern era that we see slippages between science fiction and mainstream literature. When I say mainstream, it's like the realistic fiction that most people read. For example, Thomas Pynchon, Thomas Pynchon, Thomas Pynchon, very important writer whose name you should know. Thomas Pynchon is one of the most highly regarded mainstream literary writers, but he almost always has science fictional elements, jokes, and intertextual, meaning like he's referencing other things, allusions in his work. But you will not find Thomas Pynchon's books in the science fiction section of the bookstore. So it's during this time of postmodernism that science fiction and mainstream literature begin to overlap some. And with these mainstream writers like Pynchon, even though they're bringing some science fiction into their work, they still aren't really considered science fiction writers. And so this brings us to what you read for today's class, I and Gomorrah. Make sure you have the name of the title correct, that it should be in quotation marks, I, A-Y-E, comma, space, and space, Gomorrah, Gomorrah. So Samuel R. Delany's I and Gomorrah was originally published in Harlan Ellison's edited collection, Dangerous Visions, in 1967. So I've already talked about that in the previous lecture. I and Gomorrah is a story that explores sexuality and fetishism through particle physics and the effects of radiation on the human body. In the story, spacers are astronauts who are neutered before puberty so that their reproductive organs are not damaged by cosmic rays and hard radiation. Because you imagine when you're in outer space, you don't have the same protections the planet affords us through our magnetosphere and our atmosphere. So these spacers, if they weren't neutered, they would likely have, astronauts are just going to have damage done to their DNA. And if you imagine the DNA of your reproductive organs are damaged or mutated in some way, you can pass on those things to your children. So the story connects to ideas from the early days of the space race in the 1950s and 1960s, raising the question, is it easier to construct spacecraft and spacesuits that protect astronauts, or is it easier to adapt human beings to the environment of space? These are real questions that were being debated in the early part of the space race. Cyborgs, C-Y-B-O-R-G-S, another important term that you should put in your notes. Cyborgs, or assemblages of human and machine, first took form during this era of the space race in response, at least in part, to these debates. Returning to the story, there are some unmodified humans who are fetishists, who desire spacers, despite the fact that the spacers are androgynous and lack sexuality. These fetishists are called frelks, F-R-E-L-K-S. And the spacers basically prostitute themselves to the frelks, both as a joke on the frelks, and also as a way to deal with their own loneliness and lack of attraction to others. And so the story shows how technological interventions in the body can have unintended consequences for those whose bodies are altered, as well as change the culture around those altered bodies. So, in a sense, if the spacers hadn't been modified to take on this new, in a sense, form of human being, then there wouldn't be this fetishization, this whole culture of prostitution that surrounds them. And so the technological intervention is modifying those bodies, and then how those bodies and the people that are embodied in this spacer identity changes the culture because of that technological intervention. So very important story from that era, and to think about like how these different types of science and technological interventions are going to have an influence and an effect on both the world as well as the individuals in our world. So, as I mentioned before, I'm kind of mixing things up with the lecture. So even though you haven't seen the episode of Star Trek yet, possibly, that I assigned, I do want to go ahead and talk about Star Trek and talk about that episode. So I'm maybe giving some spoilers away, but I think it's important for you to understand the story before you really delve into it if you're not that familiar with Star Trek. If you haven't seen a lot of Star Trek shows, even though they are quite ubiquitous, meaning everywhere, I've encountered a lot of students that haven't experienced Star Trek. So it's good to know a little background before you dive into the episode that I assigned for you to watch this coming week. So Star Trek originally aired as a television series for 3 seasons on NBC from 1966 to 1969. Make sure you get the title of the series, Star Trek, those dates, 1966 to 1969, and know that it was 3 seasons on NBC. Now, Star Trek was created by Gene Roddenberry. Make sure you get his name correct. You see it on the screen. Gene, Gene, Roddenberry, Roddenberry. And he was born in 1921 and died in 1991. Now, Gene Roddenberry was a World War II pilot who then became a commercial airline pilot after the war, and later he was even a police officer. But he left the LAPD to become a full-time TV writer. And what's important to think about Roddenberry in terms of Star Trek is that he was a humanist, meaning that he sees humanity as being like at the core of what's possible, that everything should center in a sense around human beings and what we're capable of accomplishing. So he's a humanist, but he's also an agnostic. An agnostic is someone who acknowledges that there is some kind of God, but this being isn't necessarily seen as someone that you would worship or give praise to or anything like that. That it's just simply an acknowledgement that there must be a greater power that created the universe that we live in, but that being is no longer like actively involved, so to speak, in our day-to-day affairs. So he's both a humanist and an agnostic. And Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek as a wagon train to the stars. And if you're not familiar with the TV show Wagon Train was a long-running Western TV series about the westward expansion following the Civil War. And so if Star Trek is a wagon train to the stars, it means this new frontier is out in outer space for us to go into. And I think that the opening narration helps us understand that. And I'm going to read this to you. This is from the beginning of every episode of Star Trek. It's voiceover. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. So that's what you would hear before the episode began. Now, from this opening, we learn that this is space opera. It's set in space, there's a frontier, you go to new worlds, you meet new aliens, you go where no man has gone before. But I should note that in 1987, with the debut of a subsequent TV series called Star Trek The Next Generation, about Captain Picard and Lieutenant Commander Data, this phrase was changed to where no one has gone before, instead of no man has gone before. And I think it should be noted that in the past, the term man in where no man has gone before was used synonymously to mean human beings. But because of the connotation of it being gendered, this was changed to no one. Now, there's some characteristics about Star Trek that I'd like you to know about. First is it's socially progressive and optimistic about the future. So it's presenting a socially progressive message about what we can accomplish together. The second characteristic is that it blends the fantastic with the familiar. And this makes its exoticism more manageable and unthreatening to a general audience. And I think if you were to watch the pilot of Star Trek, the pilot meaning the first episode that was unaired, but which got turned into the first aired episode of Star Trek, elements of it, is that there wasn't as much of this blending. And so for a true science fiction fan, I think it was fine. But in terms of attracting a broader audience, the original pilot with Captain Pike at the helm was a little more, maybe closer to Forbidden Planet, the movie that we watched, than what Star Trek becomes. The third characteristic is social criticism of the here and now and moral lessons safely veiled in science fiction. So for example, and this is an important example, the first interracial kiss on scripted American television was an episode of Star Trek in 1968. So a little context, and this relates back to the beginning of last week's lecture. The groundbreaking Civil Rights Act of 1964 had only passed a few years prior, and it was only 1 year prior to 1967 that the Supreme Court ruled in Loving v. Virginia that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were invalid. In Season 3's Plato's Stepchildren of Star Trek, which aired in 1968, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura are made to kiss by super beings. So these super beings are kind of like toying with the crew of the Enterprise and making them do things. Now, the studio ordered 2 cuts filmed, one in which Kirk and Uhura, and again, Kirk is played by a white actor, and Uhura is African American. So they filmed 2 cuts, one in which they kiss and one when they don't kiss. But Roddenberry was insistent that they show the kiss, because that would be an important moment for people to see this on primetime television. So Shatner, who played Kirk, and Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura, ham it up in every one of the non-kiss takes. Basically, they just fool around and make fun, so that all the shots, they wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to show it on television. And so it forced the studio to run the kiss scene. And there were concerns about offending stations in the Deep South. And there were some TV stations that didn't air the episode. Now, the fourth characteristic that you should know about is that the show was very formulaic, that each individual serves as an individual episode, that this isn't like the film serials cliffhangers, or like what we see today with a lot of streaming shows, and also some shows before streaming became popular, such as the rebooted Battlestar Galactica, is that the original Star Trek, it has these self-contained episodes. They don't carry a story from episode to episode. A fifth characteristic is that there are alien super beings. And the idea here is Roddenberry was trying to show that humanity might have starships, but we are the new kids on the block. And so like all these aliens might have had this technology and been around much longer than we have. And therefore they would have more time to develop not only their technology but themselves as well. And so we're always being like kind of knocked about by these super beings. And then the sixth characteristic is that it scientifically lacks, meaning light. There's a lot of what's called technobabble. Make sure you put that word in your notes. TECHNOBABBLE, technobabble. What technobabble is the use of the rhetoric of science and technology to make it sound scientifically plausible. And so if you use a lot of technical words strung together, someone who doesn't know what they mean might think, well, this sounds sciencey, this sounds techy, and therefore maybe it would be valid. But it's really just a shorthand for some hand-wavy science fictional things that are meant to assure the audience that this is science and technology that's accurate, but in reality it doesn't carry the same weight as like hard science fiction in terms of how it develops that science and technology. Now you can see the cast and crew here in this one image above the Starship Enterprise. And so I'll just very briefly go over the different characters and who they're played by. So the crew of the USS Enterprise includes Captain James Tiberius Kirk, played by William Shatner in the helm chair there in the middle. Mr. Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy. And this is an original creation for the show that is who is half human and half Vulcan. And so he's just to the right of Kirk in the blue shirt. Then to Kirk's left, there's Dr. McCoy, played by DeForest Kelley, who kind of has this Southern gentleman style about himself. Then we have Mr. Sulu, played by George Takei, who's a Japanese American. So we have like this main character played by an Asian American when this was very rare on television. We have Scotty, played by James Doohan, and James Doohan's a Canadian. And just as a little bit of trivia, he took 6 bullets following D-Day by friendly fire. Got shot 4 times in the leg, once in the chest, and 1 time in his hand. A silver cigarette case stopped the chest shot, which thankfully allowed him to live, so we would see him portray Scotty on Star Trek. But he did have to have his right middle finger amputated because of that one shot that went in his hand. So you'll notice if you watch Star Trek carefully, Scotty is the character in the red shirt on the far left here in the image. He's often hiding his right hand or part of his right hand so that you can't see that he's missing that one finger. Just a little bit of trivia. Then we have Ensign Chekhov, played by Walter Koenig, and he's in the yellow shirt just to the right of Scotty in the back row. And so he portrays a Russian. And so this is a really innovative idea that in the future we are a unified planet without the old world conflicts, such as the Cold War between the democratic West and the communist East. And then finally we have Lieutenant Uhura in the red skirt in the back row between Kirk and Spock. And Lieutenant Uhura is played by Nichelle Nichols. And as I mentioned before, like, she made television history with that first on-screen interracial kiss with Kirk. But it's also important to note that after the first season, Nichols wanted to leave the show and return to Broadway. She was a stage actress. But she received a phone call one day from a very important Trekkie. A Trekkie, Trekkie, is an affectionate name for Star Trek fans. So this very important Trekkie was none other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the reason he called is he convinced her of the importance of her character, that people of color looked up to her. Not only the fact that she was a black woman as a lead cast member on a primetime television show, but she was also a officer. She played an important role as a member of the crew, the communications officer of the Starship Enterprise. So people looked up to her, and his argument was that she would help keep the door open for future opportunities for people of color. And so she ultimately decided to stay on the show after that phone call. Now, through these writers, we can see how the new wave influenced mainstream SF. The first and second seasons of Star Trek were the strongest. There was the most budget to hire top science fiction writers, such as Jerome Bixby, who co-wrote the story that was turned into the film Fantastic Voyage in 1966. Robert Bloch, B-L-O-C-H, wrote science fiction and horror, and is well known as the novelist who wrote Psycho in 1959, which was filmed a year later by Alfred Hitchcock and made the important film Psycho. Harlan Ellison, who wrote Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man, as I'll say in a moment, also wrote this episode we're watching for our class. Richard Matheson, M-A-T-H-E-S-O-N, wrote the novel I Am Legend in 1954, which has had several film adaptations, including the one with Will Smith playing the lead character. Then we have Norman Spinrad, who's well known for writing Bug-Jack Barron, which was serialized in New Worlds in 1969. And finally, Theodore Sturgeon, who wrote More Than Human in 1953. So all these writers were also writing for Star Trek. Now, in today's episode, or this upcoming week's episode, I asked you to watch The City on the Edge of Forever. Make sure that you know the title of the episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, that it was televised in 1967. And in the story, we see the ambiguity that I like to think makes good science fiction. The original script was penned by Harlan Ellison, but Ellison's original script was watered down by the series' stable of writers to accommodate studio demands for the show's perceived audience. I would like you all to think about how this show bridges the new wave to a more popular audience. So it's taking some of the new wave ideas but making it palatable to an audience that isn't as familiar with all the experimentalism that was taking place in the new wave. So since we have here the new wave made more palatable for a general audience. Now, The City on the Edge of Forever uses time travel to explore philosophical and ethical issues. Throughout the original series and its subsequent films, it reveals a tension between the good of the many over the good of the few, or the one, which is a cribbed version of philosopher Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism and his greatest happiness principle. So that's an important name that maybe you should know when you're on Jeopardy one day. Jeremy Bentham, Jeremy, Bentham, Bentham, and his philosophy of utilitarianism. Now, in the episode, Kirk and Spock venture into the past via the monolithic Guardian's time portal to rescue their friend and crewmate, Dr. McCoy, while setting right what McCoy evidently changed in the distant past. Basically, by McCoy, accidentally going into the past, he totally screws up the future. Basically, the Starship Enterprise disappears, which means that the Federation no longer exists. The only reason that Kirk and Spock and the others are alive are because they are on the Guardian's planet. Essentially, they are cut off from history while they are there. Now, unbeknownst to Kirk and Spock, McCoy changed history for the worst by doing something good, by saving the life of a pacifist crusader named Edith Keeler. Essentially, Edith Keeler is trying to, she's arguing for the world living together in harmony, but she believes that the way to accomplish that is through pacifism. And she essentially wants to keep the United States out of World War II against Germany and the Axis. Well, if she lives, she's successful in doing so. She's able to keep us out of the war. But by the United States not intervening in the war, guess what happens? Germany and Japan win. And of course, a lot of bad things happen as a result of that. So upon Kirk and Spock's arrival, before McCoy saves Keeler's life, Kirk meets Keeler and falls in love with her. Like, he doesn't know her role in all this. But Spock discovers what should have happened based on his tricorder's recording of the Guardian's view into the past. Ultimately, Kirk and Spock have to prevent McCoy from saving Keeler's life in order to restore the timeline and thereby return to their own present, where the Starship Enterprise and the Federation of Planets exists. Kirk is shown to pay a heavy price due to his affection for Keeler, but he makes a choice to sacrifice Keeler to avoid a terrible future for so many more people. So again, this gets tied up in this idea of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, and we see this happen again throughout Star Trek, probably most notably in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where Spock sacrifices his life to save the crew of the Enterprise. So again, giving up the one in order to save the many. So that's Star Trek in a nutshell for what you're going to be watching this coming week. So just to look ahead, this week's homework is to watch that Star Trek episode, The City on the Edge of Forever. I gave you a link that should show you legal ways to watch it, but also ask around with friends. They may have a copy on DVD or Blu-ray that you can watch. So try to watch that if at all possible. If you can't watch it, you can also read the Wikipedia entry. It'll tell you at least what the story's about. So get as much information about it as possible, but the primary thing that you want to do is watch it. But also use this time where the only assigned viewing is this episode to get caught up on your reading from the past that you might have missed, or to read ahead so you don't have as much to do later on, because I know you all have other assignments, you're having to get ready for finals soon, other projects are going to be coming due. So utilize this time. Use time management to take most advantage of this in order to keep you caught up and to maybe get ahead of yourself a little bit with your other readings. Now, due by next week is 250-word reply to the weekly writing assignment on OpenLab. Basically summarize your readings and this week's lecture. But finally, I did want to cut this lecture a little short this week to give you as much time with this catching up and reading ahead work as possible. But in the interest of the research essay, I just want to remind you all that if you haven't reached out to me yet with your plan for your topic of your research essay, make sure you email me about that so I can give you some feedback on it. My email address is jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. But also, you want to remember you need to take advantage of the library's resources for your research. And maybe just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what I mean by research, is that imagine your essay, your research essay, is your attempt to become part of a larger conversation about science fiction. And this larger conversation is something that we call discourse. Discourse. Discourse is the larger conversations that we have about things in the world. There's a discourse about politics, there's a discourse about COVID-19, there's a discourse about science fiction. And there's also, within science fiction's discourse, smaller conversations about all the different works of science fiction, including the one that you're writing your research essay about. So in addition to what you have to say about your topic in your research essay, is you should essentially engage what others are saying about the work you've chosen for your topic, or about things related to it. So, for example, if you're writing your research essay on a very popular work, like let's say James Cameron's Avatar, the film, there's a lot of research that's been published on that. And so not only would you have things to say about it, but you would want to quote things that others have written about Avatar that relate to what you have to say about it. And what I mean by this is you may find someone else saying the same thing that you want to argue. And you could say, well, this person is arguing for this, and I have these things to add to what this person has said, that I'm making more observations on my own that add to that discourse. But now you may also find in your research people that say things that you disagree with. And that's great, because this is one of the most exciting things about discourse, is disagreeing with someone. So you can say that this person says this about Avatar, but I disagree with this because, and you got to use that word because, for these reasons. And those reasons are going to be your evidence that show how you disagree with this other person about whatever it is that you're writing about Avatar. But now there's going to be some cases, particularly I think with like new works that just came out, and also video games, because scholarship on video games may not be as developed as what we might find for, like, say, books and movies and TV shows. So what you can do in that case is find what people may be saying through library sources in relationship to, say, video games in general, or video games similar to what you're writing about. And then in your essay, you create that linkage. You can say, well, this person is saying X about first-person shooter video games that are set in a science fictional setting. Well, what they say about that in general, we can also apply to what I'm writing about. And you might be writing about, let's say, the Doom reboot video game, or maybe about Anthem, or about Halo. All these different first-person shooters, even though they may not be written about in the research literature, you can make a connection to what someone else has written about this in general. So I don't want you to feel straitjacketed, meaning like restricted, because you can't find something in the library databases specifically about what you're writing about. You may have to broaden what your research includes so that you're looking for research about things like what you're writing your research essay on. And so again, make sure you make this a bookmark, that you remember this URL, library.citytech.cuny.edu, because you need to be using these resources to help you with your research. That while it is great to find out what your thoughts are about the topic of your research essay, you need to be engaging the ideas of others. You need to be quoting, you need to be citing, giving a parenthetical citation in MLA format, and then of course a references list, or works cited list rather, at the end of your document. So for some of that research, remember to go to library.citytech.cuny.edu, that you should memorize that URL, bookmark it so that you can get back here easily at any point in time. And I just want to review again some of the places that you might do some of your research. I believe in a previous class I've mentioned that you can use the New York Times, so nytimes.com. You're able to create a free account here. Go to newyorktimes.com/passes. And then from here, you're going to be asked for your email address, and you want to use your CityTech email address. That way, the New York Times knows that you're a CityTech student, which qualifies you for a free year of digital access to the New York Times newspaper. Tremendous resource. Otherwise, it would cost a lot of money, but you get it for free because you're a CityTech student. You can use this as one of your research sources because this is vetted journalistic information, and you'll likely find some leads this way. Not for every potential research project in the class, but some of you might find something here. Now, going back to the CityTech Libraries website, what we would want to do, besides like thinking of places like the New York Times, we can use the databases to find scholarly research, things that have gone through blind peer review, that have been vetted by professionals in the field. And with that, we can go and click on Find Articles. And some of the best places to go in the databases, and again, these databases comprise many, many journals, where you're able to just type a search term in the database, which then leads you to these journals. I mean, if you can imagine the way it was back in the day, whenever I was an undergraduate, I was having to go find these journals on a shelf and flip through them to try to find potential leads for my research. The database has simplified this so much for you all. So you want to take advantage of how much easier access you have to all this knowledge than we had access to in the past. So you click on Find Articles, and that takes you to all the different databases that we have. And some of the highlights include clicking here on A for Browse by Name, Academic OneFile, Gale, Academic Search Complete by EBSCO. You can go to J and go to JSTOR, another really great database. And then if you click on P and go to Project Muse, is also a very good database. So Academic Search Complete, Academic OneFile, JSTOR, and Project Muse, I think, are good places to begin with your research. Now you can also use, if I go to the L's, LexisNexis. And this will search also other newspapers and magazines that we have access to. But those won't be as scholarly as the resources we find through those databases I just showed you. LexisNexis is on the same level as like the New York Times. So make use of these to learn something about what people are saying in regards to the topic, the subject of your research essay, that work of science fiction that you chose. And if you can't find things specifically about it that people are talking about, then broaden it to look for things related to it. Either like in the video game example, if there isn't research about the video game you selected, look for the type of video game, or look for video games in general in relation to science fiction. But again, something I think I mentioned before with the databases is they don't work like Google's search engine works. It's, in a sense, garbage in, garbage out. You have to carefully select your keywords so that you get the best possible results from your searches. If you search specifically for a term, the database search engine will return things that have those specific words in it. And you'll find that each of the databases has different advanced search tools that you can play around with to further narrow down what it is that you find through those databases. And again, this is something you have to spend time with. That you don't become an expert at using the databases by spending 5 minutes with each of them. You really have to set aside the time to do the research, to find good sources that help you learn something and learn about what people are talking about in relation to the topic of your research essay. And it's learning about it from what these folks are saying, what is taking place in these conversations, that you can then talk about quoting, citing in your own research essay. That's what's key. It's like learn the conversation that's taking place and then become a part of that conversation. And you'll notice that in all these research essays, they're quoting and citing the work of others. That is discourse at action. They're agreeing and disagreeing and pointing out the things that other people are saying within their own writing. That is discourse taking place. So, with that in mind, make sure that you do reach out to me if you haven't already done so about your research essay topic. If you're having trouble with your research, let me know sooner rather than later about that. Again, my email address is jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. The weekly writing assignment will be up for you to write your 250 words about the readings and about the lecture, summarizing the highlights from that. Make sure you're still making handwritten notes for your final notebook in the class that you'll turn in at the end of the semester. And then coming up, just to give you guys a heads up, I'll be setting up a way that you can do peer review with one another on our Open Lab site. I will talk more about that next week because I don't think at this point, folks, these conversations I've had with some folks, you may not have a draft yet, that's fine. But I do want to have an opportunity where you can have others read your work and give you some feedback on it before you submit it at the end of the semester. And I'm going to be telling you all about how to do that in upcoming lectures. Okay, so nobody sweat that. That's coming up. And again, just hang in there, mask up, get vaccinated when you can, play it safe, take care of yourself and your loved ones. And if there's anything that I can answer or help you with regarding the class, make sure you reach out to me. I'll be happy to do so because I want us to see this thing through. We're almost there. Week 11, we only got 4 more weeks of class lectures and then a little bit of time beyond that for actually getting all your work done. So I will talk with you all again real soon. Take care.